Good morning and welcome to the third webinar in our series covering your preparedness journey. Today we're going to be looking at some of the best practice guides that we've seen when it comes to selecting, organising, storing and maintaining your Tier 1 oil spill response resources. My name is Tristan Barston and I am a Principal Preparedness Solutions Advisor here for the OSRL Americas region. So let's have a look. So today, our objective is we're going to examine some of the most effective ways to select, locate, organise, store and maintain your facility's Tier 1 response resources. And also we're going to look at what it takes to establish a programme that ensures your response personnel have the opportunity to practice the safe use and deployment of any of the response equipment that they've got available to them. So we're going to break this down into 6 different topics or 6 different areas that we should consider. First of all, we're going to be looking at how we go about selecting the right Tier 1 oil spill response resources for your operations. Next, we're going to look at where they should be located. Where's the optimal place we should position these resources? We're going to look at the different types, different ways we can store this equipment. We're going to see how it's organized, the best way to organize your equipment so it's immediately available to use. We're going to look at what it takes to establish a maintenance program, more importantly, effective maintenance program. How can we ensure that our resources are always ready to use? And then last but not least, we're going to look at how we can sustain our response readiness as an organization. What does it take to make sure that our people are ready to use this equipment should the need arise? Just quickly, I'm going to cover the difference between Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3. No. Tier 1 resources are the resources that are immediately available to us in the event of an incident. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. The Tier 2 are external resources, contractors, for example, or other operators in the region that we might have a mutual aid agreement with that we can bring in should the incident get beyond our control. And then last but not least, Tier 3, which is international resources. So these are specialist skills or equipment or personnel that we need to come in and help bolster our response operation. So, selecting your response resources. So there is no such thing as a piece of equipment that will deal with all responses. There are so many different things that go into choosing the right equipment for your location. First of all, what we need to understand is what our risks are at the facility or location that we're working in. Is there any historical spill data that we have recorded? What has happened at this facility or in this region before? And also we want to look at what our potential spill scenarios are. What could cause an oil spill incident? For example, if we're on a tank farm, then it could be the failure of a tank. If we run a pipeline operation, the failure of a pipeline. Exploration, drilling, whatever shipping, whatever activity you're undertaking, we need to look at that activity, see what's happened before, and see what has the potential to cause a spill. Next, we want to look at the types of oil that are transported or stored or we are working with. So there is a vast difference between how we respond to a crude oil incident, for example, and then also for a light product like gasoline or diesel. So we have to know what types of oil could be spilled. And then lastly, we need to look at the environment that we're operating in? What are the sensitivities around us that could be impacted, negatively impacted by the incident? And then how would we manage our response to make sure that we are protecting these environments or resources as much as possible? So that's the risk assessment. That's the first step. So we understand what our risks are, the oil type we're using, and what it is we're trying to protect or limit, mitigate the damage to. Now we want to look at our location. So really drawing on that third point. We want to understand what's around us. So not just what's at our facility, but what is nearby, for example, vulnerable coastlines or habitats. And we're not just talking about things like mangroves and seagrass areas. We're looking at also, it could be economical areas. So other ports, other operators. We want to understand what it is that's around us that could negatively impacted by the spill. Secondly, we want to identify access points for where we can get our response equipment to the area that's been impacted. I work in many countries throughout the Americas region, and a lot of the more difficult areas is made more challenging because access to those areas are very, very difficult. And that will have a huge impact on the type of equipment that you are going to be using. If an area is only accessible by, for example, a pickup truck, then your equipment needs to fit in a pickup truck, or you need to find something else to transport the equipment to that needed site. For example, it could be a boat. In very, very rare circumstances that we've worked in before, it could need to be helicoptered in. But again, that has a huge impact on not only the weight, but also the size of the equipment. Another thing that's very important to us is the local weather conditions and platforms. You know, here in Texas and in many other parts of the world, we get real extremes of weather conditions. It's boiling hot and very dry in the summer. You know, a lot of the creeks and rivers are either very low comes in, those creeks could be 10, 12, even 14 feet deep, very fast flowing. So that response equipment that we have needs to be able to handle those conditions. Next is the manpower considerations. How many people do we have available to us on site to actually deploy the response equipment? A good rule of thumb for us anyway, is a tier one response typically needs about 6 people on site. Now, that's just my experience, what I've seen in responses and drills and exercises that I've been on with. But the minimum size of team that you want for that initial response operation is 6. You need an on-scene commander. You need somebody in charge of safety. You need somebody in charge of observing, you know, taking detailed records, ensuring that communications are current with the on-site response team and the incident management team. And then you need at least 3 responders that are physically moving the equipment, preparing the site. So for a rule of thumb, I'd say the minimum people that we require is 6. If we don't have 6, if we have less, then the equipment that we have needs to reflect that. And if we don't have 6, we have a smaller number, we need to plan where additional personnel can be resourced from, either a local response team or even volunteers. But again, that has a huge impact on the type of equipment we select. Local response teams, we want to make sure that our equipment that we hold on site is compatible with their equipment that they could bring in and assist us with. And then the equipment that we choose, if we're using volunteers, we want something that people can be easily trained on. You know, if we've got 30 minutes, we can train them on the use of a piece of equipment or a response resource to make sure that they can not only use it effectively, but that in doing so, they can keep themselves safe. And then there's more. There's the actual equipment selection itself. Now, with skimmers, there are so many different types of skimmers, and not all skimmers can deal with all oil types. So we've got to make sure that if we do decide that we are going to use a skimmer to recover the product, that we match that skimmer type to our oil type and also the spill conditions that we are going to be working in. Containment booms as well. Containment booms, especially when we're using them on fast flowing rivers, we need to understand that there's different types of boom for different locations. And it could be that we need a certain type of boom for part of the year, and then we need another type of boom for later on in the year, especially when we're working in areas with vast differences during the dry and the wet seasons. And last but not least is sorbents. Now, I'm a big fan of sorbent material. It's very easy to use, it's very quick to deploy, and it's very easy to train people on the use of it. Obviously, there's some negatives with it as well. It does create a lot of waste, and it's not applicable for every incident that we're facing as well. But sorbents are one of those things that, as a first strike response tool, for most of the incidents that I've been involved in, sorbents are a useful tool. One thing that isn't covered in this equipment selection list that I think is important to say is never overlook the simple things. So simple things, I'm talking about things like hand tools. For the vast number of responses and exercises that I've been on, we've always struggled to find enough shovels, enough rakes, enough brushes or brooms to make sure that we can keep the site not only as tidy as possible, but do things like create temporary berms. Tied into that as well is sandbags. Sandbags are a huge benefit when we're trying to build temporary dams across river, where we're trying to build temporary berms inland or on shoreline areas. So again, remember the simple things. Make sure that we have enough of these type of resources that when we do decide to use the larger skimmers, containment booms, that we're able to support them. Talking about simple things as well, the amount of times I've been out on a location and the ropes and lines that people have to deploy the containment booms or tie off the skimmers, they're just not up to the job. Having the right line makes putting a boom in the right location or deploying a skimmer into the correct area so much easier rather than relying on some straggly piece of string that we manage to get out the back of a pickup truck or we find on the floor of a warehouse somewhere. So it's those simple little things that we need to ensure that we have that makes using the bigger equipment easier. Next is location and storage. We want to make sure that the equipment is readily accessible and deployable. So it might be that we've decided that we're going to store our equipment in a shipping container. Many of the areas that we go to do this, but we've got to make sure that that shipping container is readily accessible and deployable. And I'm not talking about the simple things like people have lost the keys to the lock on the shipping container, but also where it's located. It could be that we need to be able to get access to that with some plant, maybe a forklift. But if it's in an area where that muddies up and the ground becomes unstable when it gets wet, that's not going to help us be efficient and effective when it comes to deploying our equipment. We also want to store the equipment as close to our identified response site as possible. We want to make sure that we have things on hand that we can access quickly and then deploy. You'll see this when you see the sorbent bins that are around different facilities in certain locations. They're normally bright yellow bins with a small amount of sorbents and cleanup material in. So there's a reason that they are positioned where they're positioned, and that's because they are in an area where small incidents, small spills are likely to occur. And then not to be overlooked with the logistics and the storage is we need it in a location that it can be checked frequently and make sure that they are checked frequently. The amount of times that I've been on a site and looked at a sorbent bin, opened up the lid and it's full of drink cans and dirty rags and waste material that people have seen it's a bin and just thrown it in without checking, there's too numerous to count. So we want to make sure that once we've positioned our response equipment, then we keep it maintained. And last but not least, local coordination. We touched on this before, but we want to make sure any of the larger spill response equipment that we have is compatible with what our contractors or industry partners could bring to assist. So everybody thinks of boom connections as this, which is definitely one thing, but also we want to think about, hose fittings. We want to think about temporary waste storage equipment. We want to make sure that our resources match what is available to us. We also don't want to get things that we aren't actually allowed to use. Dispersants is a great one for this. A number of countries around the world, that pre-approval for the use of dispersant isn't allowed. So you need to have your incident, and then before you can use dispersant, you need to get approval from a government agency before you can use it. Obviously, there's a delay in getting that approval. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Is there something else, some other response equipment that we can have on site and keep our dispersant somewhere else? Because if it takes us 4 hours to get approvals, then we have 4 hours to get that equipment to site. And then last but not least, one of the benefits from having your own response equipment is you can use it, especially when you're doing your drills and exercises, to show either regulators, partners, or even the local community that you are prepared should an incident happen. So the takeaway from these two slides really is there are no silver bullet pieces of equipment that will deal with all incidents. Whatever your risks are, whatever the location you're operating, whatever the number of personnel or trained personnel that are available to you is, that's really ties into the selection of your response equipment. I really wish I could come here and say, hey, basic tier 1 package, guys, you need 2 shovels, you need 2 rakes, you need 2 brooms, you need 3 temporary storage, you need this type of skimmer and this amount of boom. But it's just not as simple as that. Now, it doesn't take long to come up with that list, 1 or 2 days of just a good communication between an organization such as All Spill Response and one of your facility managers. But it's really important that that conversation takes place. There are many, many great equipment manufacturers out there that produce some really, really good bits of kit. But All Spill Response equipment isn't cheap. And we want to make sure that we purchase exactly what we need. Okay, now we're going to talk about locating your response resources. So, as we've spoken about before, your response resources should be as close to the potential sources of all spills that you've identified during your risk assessment as possible. And this allows obviously for quick and easy mobilization using the primary method of transport. So this could be personnel physically going and carrying the response equipment to the location it's needed. It could be by vehicle, whether that's a pickup truck or another type of vehicle, truck, or by vessel, small boat. So again, based upon our risk area and the way we're transporting it to it, then that depends where we're locating our equipment. And one thing that I will say about where we choose to store our response equipment, we want to make sure that we set up the site so it's as easy to maintain and keep clean as possible. Because the site access into the area, if we've got hard standing or gravel that gives us a firm footing, really minimizes the chances of accidents, and also will save us time in accessing the equipment, loading it into our vehicle or boat, and taking it to the response site. The size of the storage area. So it might be that you need a relatively small container or shed or warehouse to store your equipment in. But don't forget, when you recover that equipment, especially from an incident, you're going to have to think about where you can temporarily store it to clean it before you put it back into the storage facility itself. So you want to make sure that you have enough area around your storage location to carry out the after action maintenance required on your equipment. And then last but not least, we've got to think about security when it comes to storing our equipment. Not just for the equipment itself, things like anchors, chains, lines, batteries, radios, whatever that type of equipment that you decide that you need. They're also attractive items for thieves. So we want to make sure that it's in a secure area. We also have to remember that oil spills don't happen at convenient times for us. They tend not to happen at 9:30 on a Thursday morning. They always happen, or they don't always happen, but they often happen overnight when it's raining, during the winter when it's cold and not very nice outside. So good lighting is very important for us to make sure that we can see what we're doing. The last thing that you want to do is trying to search for a piece of equipment or get equipment out of a storage container with a head torch. It makes it very, very difficult, and it also increases the risk of us having a problem or an incident or forgetting something, which I've done numerous times. And then one nice to have that I've seen is this fresh water supply and sanitation facilities. It's very, very good or very, very useful to us if we have a storage location for our tier one response equipment that we're going back and forth to, that we have somewhere for people to, wash up, use the bathroom, have some fresh water to get a drink. Ideally, especially if you're British, it's always very nice if you can make a cup of tea while you're managing your equipment. It raises morale and keeps people warm. So again, think about the comfort of your personnel. Think about what you can do to make it easier for them and safer for them to either take a break if they have time, or to make sure that they keep themselves clean and are able to use facilities if they need to. Okay, so now we're going to move on. We've talked about where we're locating it. We're going to look at the types of storage facilities that are available to us. So in an ideal world, we would have a warehouse or shed with enough undercover area that we can store our response resources. But there's certain things that we have to think about. We want to make sure, as we said in the previous slide, that the location, that the type of storage that we need is secure against unauthorized entry, but then also against rodents, bugs, snakes, all those things that can make unloading a shipping container rather difficult. So if we can make sure that it's weather tight, rodent proof, or pest proof, shall I say, and also personnel proof, unauthorized personnel proof, that's a very, very good place to start. We also want to make sure that it's clean, dry, and well ventilated. And in extreme environments, if we have temperature controlled area, that's a real benefit to us as well. I'm sure I don't need to point out to many of you that leaving booms, leaving any type of plastic or PVC material out in the sun means it quickly disintegrates with the UV. So we want to make sure that it's kept as clean, dry, well ventilated as possible. There's nothing worse than opening up a storage area and going in and everything that you need is covered in a thick layer of dust, or you've got rodent nests buried in amongst your boom and sorbents. So whatever we can do to prevent that, I think is very important that we do so. So tied on to that, we need to protect from direct sunlight and extremes of weather or temperature. Now, not always easy to do, but I know here in Texas, especially during the summer, we have shipping container storage, and sometimes the temperature within those shipping containers can get up to like 140 degrees, which is, my maths isn't that great, but let's say the high 50s in Celsius. So again, if we have a way to ensure that it doesn't get that hot, and it's not that we need air conditioning and all of those things, but they might need a secondary cover, a kind of metal roof that your shipping container goes underneath to protect it from that direct sunlight and extremes of temperature. And then also, especially when we're talking about the pumps and the skimmers the pumps and the other systems that we use that need fuels and oils, we want to make sure that we keep those fuels and oils separate. So in a proper flammable storage cupboard or area, that we can ensure that they are safe and can be checked frequently. And if there is a problem with them, then that problem can be dealt with quickly as well. So continuing on with what to store your tier 1 oil spill response resources in, key to making sure that we use our response equipment is it has to be organized so we can find what we need easily. So we want to make sure that if we have a skimmer, then all the ancillaries that we need to use that skimmer also stored in that same location. The hoses that we need, the pumps that we need, the lines that we need, whatever it is, we want to make sure that when we go to get this piece of equipment, we're not searching all over the facility looking for the right shackle, the right line, the fuel for the pump or the engine that we need to drive the hydraulics, for example, for some types of skimmer. So organization is the key. We also got to think about what else we're going to store there, the safety resources. So we want to make sure that in our facility, we have fire extinguishers, we have a first aid kit. We also want there to be a box of responder PPE. So incidents by their very nature are emergencies. So time is of the essence for us to move the equipment from the location where it's stored to the response site. And it could be that our responders show up and they've forgotten something, whether it's the right type of gloves, whether it's the correct type of overalls, or even a hard hat if we're going to be doing any lifting operations. So we want to make sure that we also have some responder PPE available within our storage location. Going back to the organization as well, we want to make sure that we label where different types of equipment are. There's been many times that I've been on a site where I've asked somebody, hey, can you go and get me a, 30-pound anchor? And they've gone to the site or gone to the storage location, and it's taken them 10 minutes to find the chain, the anchor, the shackle. But if it was labeled, obviously everybody knows what an anchor looks like, but where the storage, where the chains are, where the shackles are, if they're kept separately, we want to make sure that there are labels on the areas where the different pieces of equipment are stored. For the area itself, the storage area itself, it's very beneficial, I found in my experience, to have a traffic route already laid out for people coming in, loading up equipment, and people leaving. Ideally, different routes. So there's a way in and an exit. So we want to, as much as possible, think about how we're going to bring vehicles in, unload them, and send them out again. If it's a large storage area, a site map where we can put muster points, emergency escape routes, anything that we would do for a typical working area, we want to mirror for our storage area as well. And then if we've decided that we are going to do our rehab of our equipment in that same location as well, we want to have a sheltered maintenance washdown area that we can wash our equipment down after it's used, ideally with closed drains. So any oil that's on our equipment doesn't escape the facility and cause another issue for us. And then we're going to look about organizing our resources. It breaks the heart of many of response personnel when we get told, hey, response equipment is in this container. We open the doors, and there's just a huge pile of equipment that we have to unload, dig through, try and find what it is that we need. So if we can organize them correctly, then it makes getting the equipment out a lot easier for us. And there's some simple rules of thumb that we can use that hopefully are common sense. But to the front of the storage area, we want the lighter, more frequently used equipment, absorbent materials. A lot of places that I go to, especially 3M Boom, they come in these huge bales. They're not that heavy, but they are quite voluminous. And they get shoved at the back of the shipping container because they're nice and light and people can throw them over the top of everything else. But absorbent materials typically are one of the things that you use first during a response. So you want them on hand. So as you can see in that picture on the top right there, we've got our absorbent materials all on shelves, all in their packaging. This one's held in with ratchet straps there because this is actually on a vessel, so everything is tied down. But if it is needed, it's right near the front, very easy to access. There's other things like responder PPE. We want people to wear the right safety equipment before they start doing anything. Don't make them search for it. If we have any assessment tools, for example, our shoreline cleanup and assessment documentation, or pads or books, field guides, that could be stored near the front as well. Hand tools, I've said about hand tools as well. Again, these are nice and light. if we do need to move them out the way, I'd much rather move a couple of shovels and a few rakes and brooms than have to start pulling out hydraulic pumps to get to the equipment behind it. So that's nearer to the front. And obviously, as we go further into our storage area towards the back, we want the larger, less frequently used equipment, booming systems, for example, the pumps, the skimmers and power packs. You know, all those types of equipment take a little bit of time to set up and establish. And it could be that our first strike to the area is we're doing our assessment, we're using our hand tools to try and create a berm, maybe the sandbags we're filling up to make temporary walls or berms to stop the oil migrating out of the area that it's spilt before we start getting into using the booms and the skimmers themselves. So they can be further to the back once we've got more personnel arrived at our storage location and the transport needed to move it to site. And if they all come right at the beginning, at least the only thing that we've got to move is the lighter things out the way to get to these pumps and skimmers. And this is something that I think is very important that people should aim for, is to try and keep their facility as organized and as clean as possible. Now, I know I keep mentioning this almost every slide, and you're probably sick of hearing my voice going on about it, but the clean and clear access to your storage area and your stored materials is absolutely essential. Making sure that the aisles, the passageway and the exits are clear and free. You know, people are working hard. People typically, have been called in to do this, and they are rushing to try and get the response resources out. If we can make this as easy as possible for them by good housekeeping, by the correct arrangement of our materials in our storage location, then that is something that we really should strive to do. We want to make sure that our flammable, combustible, and hazardous materials are stored in a way that minimizes the danger. So we don't want our fuels in a totally different area from where our equipment's stored, but it's very important that they are kept somewhere that's easy accessible but safe. And flam vaults or flammable material containers are used for the storage of this type of resource. Again, store materials and supplies in an organized manner to ensure easy access for retrieval and transportation. Again, when we use this equipment for drills and exercises, the temptation is when we come back that we just chuck it back in the container, and we'll get to it when we get to it. But if we make it as the setup as easy as straightforward as possible, people will put the equipment back in the right place at the first attempt. Any heavier loads that we have, heavier pieces of equipment, put them on lower or middle shelves. Again, this is for your manual handling. The last thing we want to be doing is dragging heavy pieces of equipment off the top shelf. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Tristan, we know this. This is basic. Nobody's going to put a pump or a skimmer on a top shelf. And I will absolutely agree with you. Absolutely agree with you. But if you look on that bottom picture in the right hand corner there, you'll see that a lot of the response equipment are stored in these plastic totes that are then put on the shelves. And if you look in there, you can see things like yellow buoys, so flotation markers at the top there. Next one down, you can see life jackets. That's ideal. Buoys are nice and light, they're air-filled plastic tubes, for want of a better thing. Life jackets, nice and light. We can take that container out. But there's certain things that I've seen where we've used these plastic tote tanks, plastic storage containers, plastic totes, that they've put things like tools, they've put things like shackles or chains in, and then shove them on a top shelf. And that's fine if you're a big strapping person that can lift 75 pounds above your head easily. Actually, no, that's not fine. My safety manager will tell me off for that. But what somebody might be physically able to do, somebody else isn't, and you're putting them in great danger. They're pulling a plastic tote off a top shelf and it's full of anchor chains, then that's going to overwhelm them pretty quickly. So again, it's very important for us to think, hey, where are we putting our equipment so anybody could come in and lift it off the shelf easily? And talking about manual handling, we want to make sure that if it's available to us, if any of these tools that make carrying, lifting, moving equipment easier is available to us, that we use them. For example, forklifts or hydraulic jacks, or even pallet trucks. If we have them available, we want to set up our storage that we can get in there with our pallet truck, put it on the pallet that the pump or the skimmer is on, and then pull it out. So again, when we're thinking about shipping containers for our equipment, how are we going to get it into the shipping container? First of all, we'll need a ramp on the front to be able to do that. Okay, so we've spoken about selecting your response equipment. We've spoken about where we're going to put the response equipment and how we're going to store it and organize it. Now, how are we going to maintain it? How are we going to set up this effective maintenance program? And again, the maintenance program is not a one size fits all. It really depends on the type of equipment that you have. Apologies for this slide. It's so wordy, but the key elements in this slide is we want to break them down into simple weekly tasks, simple monthly tasks, quarterly, and then annually, getting more in depth and more complex as the period of time between the checks increases. So weekly, something simple as a security check. If we've got our equipment in a shipping container with a padlock, is the padlock on? Do we know where the key is? Also, make sure that that padlock works, open it up, and then do a brief visual inspection of the storage area, looking for any major problems. So any damaged equipment, any leaking or missing equipment. We can do that on a weekly basis. Then every month, the visual check of equipment for condition and serviceability. So now we're spending a little bit longer looking at each piece of equipment individually. We're not getting it off the shelves here or out of the storage location. We're just looking around it, making sure that the piece of equipment it says visually looks okay. What is important, if we do see something wrong, we want to make sure that that is brought up to our line manager, to our managers, and that we can arrange either for repairs or other work, whatever work's needed to be carried out to make sure that we maintain our equipment's readiness. And then quarterly, every 3 months, we want to do an inventory check of the equipment. Is what we think there still there? Again, this is another nice visual check that we can do. We say that we've got 10 packets of 3M boom. Is there 10 packets of 3M boom? Yes or no? If we have internal combustion engines, so any pumps, for example, the spate pumps or hydraulic pumps, if they've got petrol or diesel engines, we want to run them. So you take them out of the storage area first and run them. Run them for a good at least 15 minutes each. Quarterly as well, for some of the smaller pieces of equipment, is an ideal time to take a small part of your emergency response team and just practice on a piece of equipment. So we're not deploying the piece of equipment, but let's say we want to remind ourselves how a spate pump works or any kind of water pump that we're using. We get that water pump out, we run through the safe start procedures, with our little team, we run through how we would use it. We'd run through, do we need to prime the pump, how the connections fit, the hoses fit. We look at the ancillaries that we need. So we do that at the actual storage location itself. So we're not talking about a exercise here. We're just talking about refreshing ourselves on a piece of equipment. And again, once we've done that, we want to make sure that we keep a record that we've run or used this piece of equipment and report any issues. And then we have our yearly maintenance that happens once a year. Now, depending on the products that you have, the engine that you have, it could be that we need to change the fuel, the oil, the air filters, whatever it is that is recommended in the manufacturer's maintenance manual that we do. Now, I would recommend in many of the areas that we work in, if you don't use stabilized fuel in your engine, and you keep it, you know, full or half full, that you drain and change that fuel in your engines, because it gets badly affected, especially when you are working in hot or humid conditions. Also, the annual inspection is a perfect time for us to conduct our major mobilization exercise to get our booms out, get our skimmers out, get everybody used to how we would deploy this equipment, how we would take it to a response site, how we would set it up, and then how we would take it back from this response site and put it back to our equipment storage. And that really ties into our next slide when we're talking about sustaining our response readiness. So it's all very well that we have this equipment, that we've stored it correctly, that we're maintaining it, that we're looking after it as much as possible, that we're getting the most value for money out of this equipment. But we want to make sure that if something was to happen, that the personnel that we have available to us can use that or those response resources as effectively as possible. And the way we do that is through regular drills, exercises, and competency training. You know, there is nothing that beats a drill when it comes to actually physically using the equipment in the environment that we're going to be using it. You know, All Spill Response, we deliver many different training courses. But when it comes to for example, the IMO level 1, IMO level 2 courses that require physical hands-on use of equipment, unless you're going to come to one of our response bases and deploy our equipment for a very good overview of all different types of response resources that are out there. The next best thing is having the trainer come to your site, use your response equipment in the environment that you're going to be operating in. That way we can identify good work practices, we can identify any bottlenecks, and we can, as it says there, familiarize ourselves and yourselves with how we can use the resources that are available to us in a safe and effective manner to mitigate any incident that we could face. And another thing that catches many people out is the amount of time it would takes us to respond to an incident. Once we've been alerted that an incident's occurred, very often what I've noticed is with no warning, it takes even a well-trained team at least 45 minutes to an hour to get the resources out and start responding at the site. Obviously, it varies widely depending on the facility that we are working in, but a good rule of thumb is it takes, 45 to 60 minutes to get to the location with response resources. And that can come as a shock to people. But if you think about it, if you are operating next to a river and the flow in that river is 3 knots, If it takes you an hour to get your response equipment ready and down to the site or the source of the spill, that leading edge of the spill could now be 3 miles away if it's gone with the flow of the current in the river. And again, that impacts how we're going to respond and set up our tactical response plans. As it says at the top there, communication is key. Communication, not just within the emergency response team as itself, but also between the emergency response team and the management team. That way, the management team can know and understand that, yes, the incident's been dealt with safely, or, hey, we're dealing with the incident safely, but we need more response resources. How can that incident management team support you to make sure that what we do is effective and we mitigate that incident as quickly as possible? Also, the exercises that we do should be based upon events that could happen at our facility. And we want to make sure that we run through everything that we would do if there was an incident. There's an example scenario there. A facility experiences a release from a truck loading rack. So one of the fuel trucks, obviously, there's an area where these fuel trucks get loaded. Now, the response plan might call for a nearby shut-off valve to be closed that keeps the spill on site rather than draining into a nearby ditch. So this is a perfect opportunity. Yes, we might be using our response resources to practice damming that ditch, putting our absorbent material, recovering any spilt oil, ensuring that it doesn't leave our facility. But again, right at the start, our operators, we want to make very, very clear that if this happens, the valve, the button to push, the valve to close, and how we communicate with our line manager that this has been done. We also want to check our plans. It could be that the facility's been updated. It could be there's a different way of dealing with that incident, of closing or stopping that pump now. We want to make sure that the response plans that we have match the actions that we would be required to do on site. So as I said right at the start, selecting your tier 1 response equipment tends to be, or is, very, very site specific. It depends upon your operation, your location, your resources, logistics, storage area, very, very many moving parts. And All Spill Response is here to help. It's quite a quick and painless process once you have that initial discussion about what your risks are, where you're located, and all the rest of the topics that we covered in those first 2 slides. So All Spill Response is here to help and support you as much as possible. Again, we're not an equipment manufacturer. We're the end user of this equipment. So we know what works and what doesn't work. We're not here to try and sell you the latest amazing doodah, that will magically make all disappear. We're here to guide you to select what will work for your operation. So there's a number of ways that we do this. Obviously, our duty managers and preparedness managers, such as myself, actually I'm not a manager, but maybe soon. But there are self-assessment tools like our Ready Check assessment or capability review guides that help you get that initial picture of what your risks are that are available on our website. If you have drills and exercises planned for next year, for 2024, we can offer to support long-term, where we develop your yearly exercise for you, or even short-term, where you just get, it could be a duty manager or someone like myself on site to help guide you through the process, or even just to observe. We also do training, like I said, either on-site specific to your location, or you could come to us. Capability reviews, if you say, hey, we have response equipment, but I don't know if it's the right type, then we can help guide you. Yes, this is useful. This is useful, but only in this scenario, for example. And then last but not least, with your contingency plans, making sure that your contingency plans that you have match what actions you need to carry out in the event of an incident. So stay in touch. We are an international emergency response organization. We are here to prevent oil spills or emergency incidents from occurring. We have years of knowledge for doing this. And if we don't have that experience, or the person that you're talking to doesn't have that experience with an oil spill response, we certainly know somebody that we can reach out to and who has that experience, who we can pick their brains and get an answer back to you. So as you can see on the screen there's my email at the top there, Tristan Barston. There's also one of our key duty managers, Elmer Emmerich, who is very, very knowledgeable about probably 99% of the facilities and operations that happen, especially in the South America region. Houston, where I'm based, and then also the duty managers as a whole. You can find us on social media, but what I would advise, your first point of call is go to our website, which is www.oilspillresponse.com. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. I look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar, which will be webinar 4 in December, where we will be covering drills and exercises. Again, thank you very much for your time and have a great day.